For this issue's Closer Look segment, we're going to take a look at some of the steps to get you through gluing up large panels. Now, panel glue-ups, as you can see here, we're going to be, in this case, making one out of 5 pieces, or one panel out of 5 individual boards. Now, you may be tempted to try and buy a board that's this wide. Now, you're going to pay a big premium for that piece of lumber because anything that's over about 12 inches wide, sawmills start to attach on a premium price. Now, if you've done this type of panel glue up before, you may have had some good success, and sometimes you may have had very disappointing results. Now, one of the problems, especially in cherry, is selecting your material so that it has a nice even color across the whole surface. Now, this will be true of other woods as well, maple, even walnut. Now, the process actually starts back at the sawmill when we pick out the material. Now, if you're picking out rough sawn lumber, it does take a keen eye and a little bit of experience to help you judge the color ranges of the wood that you're picking out. So the way we do it, we go to the sawmill, select from all the boards that are available, and try and pick the ones that are close in color range. Then we bring all the material back, and then we start planing it to an approximate thickness. Now, this top that we're demonstrating here is going to be 1 inch thick. So right now it's planed to 1 inch and a 64th. And that way we've got a little bit of material on here to clean up after the glue up is cured. By planing it at this point, I also have a good visual key as to what color and grain patterns we have to work with. Now, the stability of a top like this can be a bit of a problem, either if it's one whole panel or if it's made up out of several individual pieces like this, because you don't really want this thing warping and twisting over time, because that can really torque and twist up your carcass. One of the tools that'll help you with selecting this wood and making sure that the moisture content is fairly even across all the pieces is a moisture meter. Now, this particular unit doesn't have the pins on the back, so we can place it right on our workpiece and get a direct reading on it. So we'll go through, we'll take a look at what we've got here to start from. On our first board, we're 9.9, 10.0, 10.03, 9.7, and 10.0. We're all within 1% moisture content across all of these pieces, and that's very good. Now what we want to do is determine our color pattern and our grain matching. Now, this is a very important step, and you should really take some time to do it, because what you do now, the effort that you put in right now, will be visible and highly visible for many years to come. So take your time and go through and select the boards, spin them around, flip them face to face and so forth, picking the best grain and pattern match and color match so that you've got a nice gradient flow from dark to light, rather than from dark, light, like a stripe pattern. Take that time. So now let's go through that process. So we'll look at our first board, and we've got a dark area in here, the makings of a knot, I would guess. And this face is nice and even in color, so we'll keep that one up. This one's got a little dark area here, and this side's pretty clean. So we'll keep that face up. And these two boards match up nicely in color. Now here you can see a lot of pitch on the board, and the other face is good and clear. So we'll keep that one up. Here we've got a big knot, so I certainly don't want that up, and the other face is good and clear. And for our last board for this glue up, we've got another knot on that face, and this one's pretty clear. So these are all our good faces of each of the boards. Now my next step is to try and figure out if there's a color variation between them. Now this board in this area you can see is a little bit darker, but this board also has that dark streak in it. And they're more pinkish in color. This area here, this is more brownish to yellow. And this final board's a little bit white. So I've got kind of a gradient pattern going from dark back to light. Now if I were to take this light board, place that in the middle, it's really going to stand out a lot. It looks like it's striped. Even if we do stain it, which we probably will put a toning stain on this project, I don't want that much color variation. I'd rather it be an even or a continuous change in color across the whole surface. Now that I've got my orientation set up for each of the boards so that my color and grain patterns are nice, what I want to do is draw a diagonal line across all of the boards, and that will help me with realignment as we go on to the next step. And I'll also number them, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or whatever the case may be. All I want to be able to do is just mix these boards up, as we probably will during the glue-up process and so forth, and then get them back in the same orientation. Now, what we need to do to get a good glue-up with good tight joints is we've got to make sure that the face is square to the edge, and the joiner is the best tool to do that. So what I'll do now is go over to the joiner, joint each of the edges so that I've got a nice square face to start from. Now you shouldn't just trust your jointer to give you a nice square edge. You should check your joiner with a square, and then of course check your board to make sure that the edge is in fact square to the face of the board. The next thing that you want to check after jointing is to make sure that you've got straight edges. And that's a real easy check. Just bring all of your boards edge to edge like this, lining them up, and they should come together good and tight, and you shouldn't have to push on them to draw them together. Because if there's any bow or cup in it this way, as you clamp it together, the glue dries, it's always going to be under tension at those low points. So have a nice, true, straight edge to begin with, and that will minimize many of your problems. Now, if there's anything that'll frustrate a woodworker more, it's not getting the surface fairly flat after glue up. And as we can see here, in this spot here, we've got about a 64th misalignment, this board being a little high. This one is a little bit high, maybe a 32nd above these two boards. And over here we've got almost a 1/16 of an inch. And that varies, that difference in depth or height varies across the whole board because we know this board isn't perfectly flat. Now here in the middle area, it's almost perfectly aligned. Back at the far end, we're off a little bit, but not nearly as bad as this. So what we need to do is get this glued up so that these edges all line up fairly close, because the closer we get it now, the less work we have to do later. Now, while we're talking about this alignment issue, we should also talk about the strength of the glue up for the top. Now, the nice part about a panel glue up is this is truly the ideal gluing surface. We've got long grain wood being glued to long grain. That is ideal. As long as you joint that surface and have a nice true surface to start with, you've got the perfect gluing surface. Now back to the alignment issue, there's a number of different ways we can help with aligning the boards during glue up. We could machine a groove along each edge and put a spline in there. Now that spline will end up showing through on the end grain, and that's rather unappealing in some cases. One of the more popular methods today is to use biscuits. Use a good quality biscuit joiner, and that will cut slots on the edge of the board. You insert your biscuit, and then the biscuits help to align the two boards together. Now with a good quality biscuit joiner, that'll work very well, but with some of the lower quality biscuit joiners, unfortunately it can create more problems than it cures. Now we really don't need the biscuits for strength. As I mentioned, this is the perfect gluing surface. So now what I want to do is get to the next step. How do we glue this together and align the boards? Again, you could use biscuits, but another more conventional and perhaps old-fashioned technique is to use clamping cauls. Now a caul is used to help in alignment or to help distribute clamping force. Now in the case, the most simplest form, we could clamp these boards, our top, to this caul, and that would hold everything in alignment. Now that's the most simplest form. Now one of the more conventional ways that cauls have been made over the years is to take your material. Now in this case, this is a 2x3, probably not the best material because it warps and it twists and so forth. But as you'll notice, there's a gap here. It's wider at the ends and it's currently tight in the middle. And the way that'll work, we slide this over the end of our board and then we tighten up these clamps. And because of that crown on the two boards, we're assured of applying clamping force right in the center first, and then we draw down the two ends, thereby distributing that clamping force across all of the pieces and assuring us that we should have, in theory, a nice flat glue up. Now, I don't like this method for a couple of reasons, and primarily, it's hard to get that crown machined on there very precisely, because if you've got any unevenness along that surface, the two boards in the area that perhaps where we've got a gap, well, they're not going to be pulled into alignment very tight. I don't like to use, of course, pine. You should use a good quality hardwood if you want this style of caul. Now, another type of caul is actually combined into a clamp. And this is a fairly ingenious little clamp. Now, you'll notice that we've got our crown in here. It's not quite as pronounced, but this is a two-way clamp, so to speak. It's spring-loaded, so we can slide it over the end of our board. Then, as we draw clamping pressure in this direction, it pulls on these two pivot points, which draw the two cauls against the faces of the board. Works out very well. Now, there is another method that we've been trying out here for a little while at the shop, and we're finding it works very well. And it's another homemade caul, but instead of machining it with a crown on it, we're making them as a box beam. And that will give us the flatness and the strength and the rigidity to clamp this panel flat, and then as we draw it together, we're assured of a good flat glue up. Now here are the cauls that I'm talking about. They're very simple to make. They require very minimal hardware. We've got some 3/4 inch birch plywood. We've got two pieces, and they're constructed like a box beam, so they're very rigid. We've got 8-inch long carriage bolts, along with the type of nut that you want to use, either a hex nut or a wing nut. You really don't have to put a tremendous amount of clamping force against the faces. All we need to do is bring those pieces into alignment. Now, we also go through and put some packing tape on these faces so that the glue won't stick to these surfaces. Then you just slide it over the end of your boards, tighten up your screws, and that will draw all of the pieces together good and flat. Now, to make this particular unit, we'll show you how to do that, and we'll also include plans on the DVD, and these are set up for about 36 inches long. Now, because of where the bolts are positioned, you can get a panel that's about 32 inches wide in here, and that'll actually handle a wide variety of your projects. For larger tabletops, you may want to make them a little bit longer and perhaps a little bit taller this way. To get started on the cauls, I've gone through my scrap pile and found some strips of 3/4 inch birch plywood that's long enough. In this case, it's about 36 inches long, so that'll be the length of my cauls. Now what I want to do is rip two strips at 1 3/8 inches wide and two strips at 1 7/8 inches wide. Now we want to take those four pieces that we've just ripped and create this box beam structure. And of course, that's a very rigid structure. Now to do that, I'll start out by applying glue along the edge of the 1 3/8 inch wide strips. Then I'll take the 1 7/8 inch wide strip and place that on top of the two 1 3/8 inch wide strips and just line up the edges a little bit. I'll trim those up flush later on. Now what I want to do is very carefully line up the outer edges so that they're nice and flush so it looks pretty decent. And tack it in place with some brads. And I'll go along each side doing this. And now we'll put the other faceboard on the same way. Apply glue, line it up carefully, tack it in place with some brads. And after the glue's had a chance to dry, we can trim up the ends nice and square. Then it's just a matter of laying out a couple of hole locations. We're going to come in 1.5 inches from the end and then centrally located across its width. And we'll drill one hole at each end, and those will be for the 3/8 inch 16 clamping screws. Now the size drill that I'm using is 13/32, and that gives us a little bit of clearance for the bolts to have a little play as we push them through there. After everything's sanded up, apply your favorite finish, perhaps a water-based polyurethane or something of that nature, and then a coat of wax. Now another alternative to a good finish to keep the glue from sticking to it is to use packing tape. Now you can pick this up at most department stores, office supply stores and so forth, and it's a very thin plastic tape, similar to cellophane tape, but the glue doesn't stick to it, and should it stick, you can just peel the tape right off. So apply that to the two faces, and then we can do our final assembly. Now for a clamping screw, I'm using an 8-inch long 3/8 16 carriage bolt. I'll slide that up through the bottom, through the top piece, and then a flat washer, and then you can either use a hex nut or a wing nut. We're really not going to be putting that much clamping force on this. Thread your nut on, tighten it up to draw your carriage bolt up into the surface. And that way it won't spin on you when we go to use it the next time. Doesn't take a lot of force, just snug up your wing nut. And now we're ready to glue up the panel. And you might be wondering, well gee, what's the best adhesive or glue to use for gluing up a panel of this type? There's really just a wide variety of glues. Each one has its advantages. I myself like the long open time glues so that I can work everything. I can fit things up along the way. I don't have to rush. I don't have to worry about the glue drying before I get everything clamped up. Now polyurethane is one of those glues that has a nice long open time, but it does require that the project, or in this case the panel, sit in clamps for a real long time. Now polyurethane glue only requires that you apply it to one of the surfaces, or in our case one of the edges. You don't have to apply it to both surfaces. You do want a good complete coverage, and you don't want to starve the glue joint. You don't want to put too much on because that's wasteful and messy. So as time goes on, you'll learn how much glue to put on. So now what I'll do is I'll apply glue to each of the edges. And with polyurethane glue, you don't want to get it on your hands. If you get it on your hands, it'll stay on them for a very long time. So I like to use rubber gloves, and that way I can be somewhat messy and not worry about having glue on my hands for a long time. Once we get a bead down the center of each board, what we want to do is spread it out and make sure that we've got good coverage across the whole surface. Now you can use a brush or a shim of wood or something like that, a putty knife. I myself find it just works out well to use my finger. Got the rubber gloves on, so I'm protected. Just want to make sure I've got the full surface coated. So I'll just take my finger and spread it around. Now I should also point out that I make my panels oversized at this point. They're about 1/4 to 3/8 of an inch too long, and the whole panel width is about 3/8 of an inch too wide. And what I can do then is, after I get everything glued up, I can actually trim it up to its exacting size at that point in time, and not have to worry about perfect end alignment of each of the individual boards. Now you'll notice that I've also got the cauls laying on the bench, and my boards are sitting on top of them. And that just saves me a step later on, because the first thing we want to do once we get the glue spread around is draw these cauls together. We want to clamp the board flat first and then clamp the boards together. Now we'll just line up the edges so that they're fairly even, and then we can bring in the top bars of each of our cauls. Now I've positioned my cauls so that I've got enough room to get a clamp on the outside edge of the two outer cauls. Now what I want to do is take the nuts and just snug them up at this point. Notice I'm not, again, worried about clamping it in this direction yet. What I want to do is make sure I've got my panel flat before clamping it together. Now you'll notice that our panel's width is less than our caul's length. So if I were to really tighten this down good and tight, it's going to bow up in the middle area here. And that would allow these boards to move from one another and we wouldn't have good alignment. So I'm not going to tighten these down real tight. Again, I just brought them down snug. And on this end, I can tighten them up because they're tightening right against that outermost board. So what I want to do now is bring a clamp down on top at these 3 points directly over the outermost board. Now what I want to do is check to make sure, and they should already be very flat, but I want to check to make sure that we've got good alignment. If they're out of alignment a little bit, I'll just take a rubber mallet and tap either the board up or down a little bit to get the surfaces nice and flat. Now we can go ahead and clamp them together in this direction. Now you might be asking how many clamps and how much clamp pressure. Well, according to the glue manufacturers, you do want a tremendous amount of pressure clamping all these boards together. So you do want to have your clamps good and tight. However, don't over tighten them to the point where your panel starts to bow. And you can usually see that in the curvature of the beam on the clamp. You'll see it to actually start to bend. You're probably putting on too much force at that point and drawing the panel out of flatness. Now these caul clamps, all you need to do is tighten them up enough to bring the panel flat. Now I'll actually remove these cauls after the glue's had a chance to take set. Now with PVA glues or yellow woodworking glues, that could be as little as 15 minutes or so. But with the polyurethane glue, I'll wait till it foams a little bit, which could be as much as a half hour, an hour. Then I'll remove the cauls, but I'll still leave the end clamps in place. Now another important consideration is the procedure, the timing of when we do certain things. If we were to clamp up these clamps first, draw those in, then we start to tighten up our cauls, we have to overcome the clamping force against each of the boards. And in some cases that can be very, very difficult, and especially with glues that set very quickly because they've got a very fast high tack, and trying to get them to shift under clamping force in this direction can be next to impossible. So I like to clamp it flat first, then clamp all the individual boards together. An ordinary paint scraper is a great tool for removing most of that glue squeeze out. Now your next step is to go through and flatten up the panel, but that's the subject of another story. All around, our cauls work out real well. It's a very simple yet effective method of making sure that you get a nice flat panel for your panel glue ups. I'm Chris DeHut for Woodworking at Home magazine. Thanks for watching.